Hi, and welcome to the second presentation for Week 1 in IS-286. In this presentation, we are going to review some iOS basics that you learned in IS-284. Hopefully you can recall all of these basics, but they are important enough to review. You will be using all of these items that we review here in this presentation throughout all of IS-286. Here's what we will be reviewing throughout this presentation. We will take a look at the Command Line Interface or CLI Help feature and learn how valuable a tool it can be. And again, you use this feature a lot in IS-284, but you'll need to continue to use it here in IS-286. We will also take a look at show commands in general, as well as a few specific ones. We will then examine some of the commands required to complete a basic configuration on a Cisco router or switch. Again, something that you did in IS-284 on a router. And we'll also take a look at the commands required to configure various interfaces on routers and switches. And then finally, we'll review how to manage configuration files. The Cisco iOS Help feature exists to provide help with the iOS commands. To access the CLI Help feature, you just use the question mark. On this slide, you see three different ways that you could potentially use the help feature. In the first example, you see that the question mark is typed directly after the prompt. When using the help feature in this way, you will get a list of all the commands that you could potentially use at that prompt. In the second example, you see the question mark is typed after the first two letters of a command have been typed in. You can use the help feature in this way to determine the entire command if all that you can remember is part of it. The third way that you see the help feature used on this slide is by typing the question mark after a command. Using the help feature in this way will provide you with the next part of the command sequence if that command has multiple words, or if you already have the entire command prompt typed in, the help feature will show you potential arguments that could be typed in next. Now we are going to take a minute or two to talk about show commands. You should remember that show commands are not used to change the configuration. Rather, they are instead used to verify and troubleshoot a configuration. You can use some show commands in user executive mode, but most show commands are accessed in privileged mode. You can also access show commands from the different configuration modes by putting do in front of the show command. This is a great feature that keeps you from having to switch back and forth between modes when you want to verify a configuration, and it can save you some time. On this slide, you see some examples of show commands. The show running -config command is one you're familiar with, and it will show you the current running configuration. The show startup -config will show you the startup configuration. The show IP interfaces command will give you information about all of the IP interfaces, such as fast Ethernet interfaces and serial interfaces. The show version command will give you information about the iOS version, and the show flash command will give you information about the flash memory. Now, of course, there's a seemingly endless list of show commands, and you'll learn about many of these in this class, and of course you've already learned about some in IS-284. If you would like to see all of the show commands that are available from Privileged Executive Mode, just go to that mode and type show, and then the question mark. Now, you should recall that Cisco routers and switches use the same IOS or Internetwork Operating System. Of course, when looking at specific devices, you may have devices running newer or older versions of an iOS than another device, but all routers and switches use the same Cisco iOS. Therefore, many of the commands that you learn about for routers will also apply to switches. There are some iOS commands that are only used on a router or a switch, but if you have a router and a switch that are running the same iOS version, then both devices have the same set of commands available. Keep in mind, this only applies to Cisco routers and switches. If you have a router or switch that was manufactured by another company, then that device will have a different operating system possibly. On this slide, we will review some commands that you learned about in IS-284. Specifically, the commands here are those required for configuring the host name and a banner message of the day. Notice first of all that we started out in user executive mode, and this is the mode that you access first on a Cisco router or switch. As you should recall, in order to get into privileged executive mode, you have to use the enable command. Please note that all the commands on this slide were typed using a black font. The prompts and arguments are in a white font. After getting into privileged executive mode, you then have to type the command configure terminal in order to get into global configuration mode. Global configuration mode is, as you know, where you must begin all configuration changes. Once in global configuration mode, the first item that is configured here on this slide is the host name of the device. Notice that the command is host name and the argument is ISP, which is what we are naming the device. So what this has done is change the host name of our router from router to ISP. Notice on the next line that the prompt is now changed to reflect that host name change. After changing the host name, the next task here on this slide that we accomplish here is the configuration of a banner message. In this instance, we are configuring a banner message of the day, or banner MOTD. And we can make this banner say anything that we want, but we must begin the message with some type of delimiting character and then end it with that same delimiting character. Remember, it does not matter what delimiting character that we use, but we have to use the same one in order to begin and then end the message. In the example on this slide, I've used the $sign. I could have used any of the special characters that can be accessed by holding down Shift and then hitting any number key. Now on this slide, we are continuing with a review of a basic configuration. Notice that we are still in global configuration mode. The first command demonstrated on this slide is the line command. This command indicates to the router that we want to configure a line. And in this instance, we are starting out by configuring line console 0, which you should remember is the console port on the router or switch. After indicating the line that we want to configure, the next command sets a password of Cisco for the console connection. In order to require the password to be used when consoling in, the final step is to use the login command. At this point, anyone who tries to console in on this router or switch will be prompted for a password. If they do not enter the password of Cisco, then they will not be allowed in. Okay, now let me remind you of just a few password basics here. First off, when in a lab environment, I suggest using a simple password and always using the same password. Of course, in LabSim, you'll be given specific directions. But this way, if you're working in a lab environment, you'll never forget your password, and you'll be able to avoid having to do any password resets. Now, in the real world, however, you do not want to use simple passwords, and you do not want to use the same password over and over again. Doing so would obviously not be secure. Now, the next configuration that you see on this slide is the creation of a VTY or Telnet password. First of all, notice that I use the exit command to get back to global configuration mode. In this instance, I did not have to do this because I was going to configure another line, but I wanted to demonstrate and remind you of the exit command in case you might have forgotten about it. Next, you should recall that the command syntax for configuring a VTY password is identical to the password configuration for the console connection. Okay, so at the bottom of this slide, I'm done with my line configuration, so at that point I use the exit command in order to go back to global configuration mode. This slide demonstrates the enable and enable secret passwords, which you learned about in IS-284. Notice that after typing the exit command on the previous slide, we are now back in global configuration mode. And in order to create an enable password, we just use the enable password command. As you can see on the slide, we have set the enable password to Cisco. In order to create an enable secret password, we must use the enable secret command. On this slide, we have set the enable secret password to Cisco as well. One of the more important configurations to make on any Cisco router or switch is interface or port configurations. So I will take a minute or two to refresh your memory on these. For routers, you have to configure Ethernet, Fast Ethernet, and Gigabit Ethernet interfaces, as well as serial interfaces. Now don't forget, when configuring these interfaces, you have to give them an IP address and subnet mask. Also, these interfaces are down by default on a router. Therefore, when configuring an interface on a router, you must use the no shutdown command to bring the interface up administratively. Contrary to this, switch interfaces are enabled by default. As a result, you can use a switch straight out of the box without performing any configuration. However, of course, there are many performance and security reasons for configuring a switch beyond the simple configuration that it has by default. Now, there are several things that you need to remember about managing configuration files on a router or switch. First, you need to remember that when you make changes, you are making changes to the running configuration, and those changes take effect immediately. You also have to consider that in order for the configuration changes to become permanent, you need to copy the running configuration to the startup configuration. Of course, as you learned in IS-284, if you power cycle the router or switch without copying the running configuration to the startup configuration, then your configuration changes will be lost. Next, you have to consider the possibility that a hardware malfunction could cause you to lose your configuration or even force you to replace the device. In either of these cases, you need to have a backup of the device configuration to either reload it onto a repaired device or to load it into a new device. Configurations can be extremely long and complicated, so the last thing you want to have to do is to start from scratch. There are a couple of different options for backing up a router or switch configuration. You can back up the configuration files or copy the configuration to a text file. Configuration files can be backed up to a CD or USB drive, but one of the more common ways to back up configuration files is with a TFTP server. In this case, you are saving the running, or more commonly the startup configuration, on a TFTP server. To save a startup configuration to a TFTP server, you use the copy startup-config TFTP command. After entering this command from privilege mode on a router or switch, you are prompted for two pieces of information: the remote host or TFTP server, and then what you want to name the file. The third and final prompt asks for confirmation of your entries. For the remote host entry, typically you just enter the IP address of the TFTP server. And as you should recall, you can also copy the iOS itself to a TFTP server. One time that you definitely want to do this is when you are updating the iOS. Just in case the updated iOS causes problems on your network, you want to have a backup of the original iOS that you've been running so that you can restore it. You can copy the iOS file to a TFTP server using the copy flash TFTP command. If you would like to learn more about using a TFTP server and see it in action, please go to the student resources for week 2, which of course are on the Blackboard course site. There are some links there to videos that will demonstrate these backups. There is also a link to a video that shows you how you can set up a TFTP server. This video will tell you where you can go to get some free TFTP software as well. I hope that you have found this review useful, and this concludes the second presentation for week 1 in IS-286.